So as I mentioned, so taxes, in the, thinking about it in this way, they're a policy lever for encouraging the behavior that society wants to see, right? Thinking about what is the optimal social quantity of things to do, and then encouraging that by taxing them more or less. This is something the United States does all the time, right? That's why our, if you ever done your own taxes, one reason why they're so complex is because there's all sorts of little taxes in there and benefits and subsidies and write-offs and whatever that are intended to encourage particular behavior. One nice thing about this, you can do this without forcing people to do stuff, right? People can still do whatever they want to do. They just got to pay what it actually costs to do it, right? They're internalizing the cost. One thing that's nice about this is it ensures the good is used in only the most valuable cases. So I mentioned you don't necessarily have to tax to get down to 20. You could just enforce an amount of 20. But what would happen then? Well, who gets the 20, right? It could be whoever happens to have the hookup to get the permit to produce the only 20 units you're allowed to produce, which might not be the most efficient producers. It might just be people with political connections, whatever it is, or it goes back to what we talked about last time. But if you do it with the tax, who gets to produce? These people, or these people are the ones who get the stuff, they're the ones who value it the most. Who gets to produce? These people, the ones with the lowest cost. So we sort of get back those nice efficiency gains from supply and demand because we are allowing people to figure out for themselves whether it is worth it for them to pay the actual cost of production, right? You say, hey, the actual cost of production, you're doing damage here, you're gonna have to pay 20 bucks more every time you produce, a car engine or whatever. So that everybody can think, well, is it actually worth it for me to still produce this at a higher, what if I pay an extra 20 bucks in taxes? And if the answer is no, that means that you are not one of the more efficient producers. If the answer is yes, that's going to be true for people who can do it more efficiently. So we're still going to maintain the idea that people who are producing are going to be the ones who probably should be producing, are going to be the most efficient use of resources. Let's give an example of this. Let's take pollution as an example. So let's say we want to produce pollution. We want to force every factory to have their output. Right? So we want to have the output of these factories. It's going to cut down on emissions by quite a bit. So we've got two different companies. We've got Frivolous Goods LLC and Important Goods TM. These both, we want them both to reduce production, right? So we pass a law that says, hey, whatever you're producing today, next year you have to make half as much. Right? That's the new law. We are going to do this so we can get from 40 to 20. Right? And that will work. We will get from 40 to 20. Right? By everybody having their output. However, if it's taxes, then each of them by themselves are going to figure out, hey, should I continue to produce at this higher amount? You can raise the tax until you get to that still having amount, but probably what would happen is that frivolous goods would reduce by a lot, and important goods would only reduce by a little bit, right? Because these people would realize, hey, wait a minute, the stuff we're making is really, really valuable. It's going to be worth it to us to make it even at a higher cost, so we're going to keep doing it. Whereas these people would be like, this is not that valuable. It's probably not going to be worth it. People are not going to be willing to buy it, and if you have to incorporate the cost, so we shouldn't be making this anymore. And that's really the idea here. It's not to get to zero on anything, really. That's not what this does. You have to need something else for that. But what it does is it makes sure that if there's a use out there that is not actually worth it, not actually worth the cost that it imposes on others, then that is the production that stops. One other note about this is that taxes as policy is hard to do right. You have to make sure that you are aiming it in the right place. You want to be sure that you tax what you actually want to be reduced. And it's very easy to try taxing something else and then being surprised when it doesn't work. So for example, if you want people to eat less fat and you tax French fries, well, guess what? They're just going to eat other forms of fat. They might eat donuts instead. It might even get worse. One really good example of this is SUVs. So back in the olden days, I think in the 80s, there was an intent to reduce to improve the gas efficiency of our cars, the car fleet in the United States. So they passed a law. They said, we're going to tax low miles per gallon vehicles, really inefficient vehicles, cars, we're going to tax them. Okay. Now, if we think about our Pagouvian subsidy idea, that should work, right? We've made it more expensive to produce inefficient cars. That should, reduce the quantity of inefficient cars, and people are going to buy more efficient cars instead. The miles per gallon in our car fleet will go up. However, they didn't tax gas usage. They didn't tax mileage. Actually, they taxed they taxed inefficient cars. You know what that doesn't include? Inefficient trucks. So the car industry invented SUVs, which are legally trucks and therefore not subject to the tax on inefficient cars, even though they're basically cars. They're legally trucks, but basically cars, but they're not subject to the tax, right? And so we saw this explosion in the popularity of SUVs. If you were around in 1996, you would know that there were Ford Explorers on every corner, just a lot of miles per gallon. The efficiency of the car fleet in the United States actually got worse as a result of this tax, which intended to make it better, because they were not taxing the thing they actually wanted to tax. They taxed something that was related to it, right? Yeah, inefficient cars, that is related to bad gas mileage, but that is not the actual thing that you want to reduce. If you don't tax the thing you actually want to reduce, you're going to end up with something else instead. So for example, if you want to reduce carbon usage, you want to tax carbon, not cars, not gas, not anything else. You want to tax the actual thing that you want to go away. But even this might not be entirely your intent. If you don't actually want to get rid of carbon, you want to get rid of greenhouse gases, then this doesn't include methane, right? You would be leaving out, people would just shift to methane instead, right? You want to actually tax the thing you want to go away for this all to work. If you don't do that, it's not going to work. Here's another good example. Jaffa cakes are a common British treat. This is what they look like. I've never had one. They don't look particularly good, but there they are. They're popular. So here's a question. Take a look at this. Is this a cake or a cookie? Raise your hand if you think it's a cake. Raise your hand if you think it's a cookie. Good question. Seems like it wouldn't matter, but it's very important because cookies with chocolate on them, that has chocolate on it, were taxed much more than cakes in Great Britain. And they spent $7 million on a lawsuit determining whether these are cakes or cookies, which is, I mean, not that much as big lawsuits go, but still, that's $7 million wasted on a pretty much irrelevant question. It doesn't matter whether it's a cake or a cookie, and yet it sort of does, right? Because of the tax. They determined that it was indeed a cake. The way they distinguished it is that a cake goes hard when it goes stale, whereas a cookie goes soft. These will go hard when they go stale, so therefore it is a cake. It's very important because it allows it to be taxed at the lower rate. Now, $7 million down the drain. Probably spending a bunch of money on lawsuits is not what was intended by whoever set that tax policy, right? They were not trying to tax, they were not really caring about the distinction between cakes and cookies. They probably wanted to maybe reduce the consumption of cookies with chocolate. And instead, because they were not taxing the thing they actually wanted to tax, you ended up with problems. There's a lot of examples of this, especially when you start looking into like tariffs and things like that. Tariffs is just a big old thorny mess of everything. If you start looking into it, because tariffs are set on specific kinds of goods. And so if you can get around that sort of particular definition of goods, then you're good to go. So one example of this is, let's say, there's another, so car parts, for example. Car parts have a different tariff rate than cars, right? And a lower tariff rate than cars. So it is not uncommon for cars to be built overseas, disassembled, shipped as parts so that they can pay the lower tariff rate, and then reassembled in the target country, which again is a complete waste. It's wasteful to take it apart, wasteful to put it back together, and yet they're doing this to get the lower tariff rate, which is not because they taxed the thing that they thought was related to what they wanted to tax, not necessarily the thing that they actually wanted to go away. So taxes are difficult to do. They're effective. They can get us to that optimal quantity if they're done right, but hard to target. You have to actually tax the thing you want to go away, or subsidize the thing that you want to happen. Subsidizing the thing that you want to happen is also difficult. You have to target the actual thing, which is difficult. There's a general social science law called Campbell's Law. It goes by a number of different names in different fields. But the basic idea is that once you start measuring something and rewarding it, you get that measurement, not necessarily the thing that you want. So, for example, if your high school teacher gets a bonus if their students do really well on the test, you might get really good test scores without necessarily getting the education that is supposed to lead to those test scores, right? Campbell's Law, you get what you pay for, not necessarily what you want.